The Dream and the Journey. 9-year-old Elijah Green sat cross-legged on the floor of his bedroom, surrounded by a sprawling arrangement of model airplanes. They were not just plastic replicas or toys to him, each one represented a possibility, a dream, a future. Elijah's bedroom was filled with an almost sacred reverence for aviation, each plane lined up meticulously, placed with care and intention, as if they were soldiers preparing for battle, each one ready to take flight. His father, Captain Derek Green, often said that true pilots saw the world not just as it was but as it could be when viewed from the cockpit. Elijah, even at his young age, understood that completely. To him, these planes weren't just machines, they were his way to the skies. He gazed at the walls of his room, each adorned with posters of various aircraft, sleek fighter jets cutting through the clouds, massive cargo planes ready to transport the world's goods, and commercial liners soaring through endless horizons. Every poster was a small slice of heaven. He had memorized the technical specifications of each aircraft. He knew the top speeds, the fuel capacities, and the precise measurements down to the smallest rivets. It was his obsession, and it fueled his dreams. Today wasn't like every other day. Today was special. It was the day Elijah would fly alone for the first time. The excitement in his chest surged, filling every corner of his being. Not just any flight, though. This flight was going to be different. This was the flight that would lead him to his grandmother's house, across the country. It was his first solo adventure, and to make it even more magical, his dad, Captain Derek Green, would be at the helm of the very plane Elijah would be flying on. The thought of his father in the cockpit, guiding the aircraft through the sky while he was seated as a passenger, filled him with pride. This was no ordinary day, it was the beginning of something. Elijah's mind raced as he ran his fingers over his favorite model airplane, a small, almost perfect replica of the sleek jet his father flew for work. The plane's blue and silver livery gleamed under the light, its engines detailed in a way that made Elijah feel as if he could feel the hum of the engines just by holding it in his hands. He could almost hear the roar of the turbines, the whine of the jet engines as they ascended into the sky. This plane wasn't just a model. It was a connection to his father's world. "You're coming with me," Elijah whispered to the plane, as if speaking directly to the spirit of the jet itself. He carefully wrapped the model in a soft cloth, as if protecting a fragile treasure, and then gently tucked it into the side pocket of his backpack. The thought of carrying a piece of his father's world with him made his heart race. He imagined that if anything went wrong, if something happened in the sky, he could always pull it out and think of his father, of the connection they shared, of his legacy as a pilot. Elijah's mother, Rachel Green, stood in the doorway of his room, watching him with a mixture of love and nostalgia. She had seen the spark of aviation in her son ever since he was a toddler, always looking up at the sky whenever a plane flew overhead. From a very young age, Elijah had shown an exceptional fascination with anything that flew. As soon as he could walk, he would crawl across the house, dragging toy planes behind him, mimicking the sounds of roaring engines. Rachel had often wondered if her son was born to be a pilot. And now, as she stood there, watching him pack his bag for his first solo flight, she knew her instincts had been right all along. "You ready, champ?" she asked, her voice a soft melody that seemed to soothe the restless energy in the room. Elijah nodded enthusiastically. "I can't wait, Mom. This is going to be the best flight ever. I'm going to be just like Dad one day. Flying planes, going all over the world. I'm ready for it." Rachel smiled and stepped into the room, crouching down to Elijah's level. "You already are, Elijah. You've got the heart of a pilot. But remember, it's not just about flying planes. It's about the journey, the people you meet along the way, and how you treat others." "I know, Mom," Elijah said, his voice filled with determination. He gave her a hug, a tight squeeze, as if to reassure her that he was ready. As he pulled back, his mother stood up and handed him a small, folded note. It was a note from his father, something she had kept hidden until now. Elijah unfolded the note and read the message aloud. It was simple, but it resonated deeply with him. Fly high, son. Never forget that the sky is not just a place, but a journey. Wherever you go, remember your roots. Elijah's heart swelled with emotion as he reread the words. He tucked the note into his jacket pocket, right next to his heart. His mother gave him a quick peck on the forehead. You've got this. I'll see you when you land. As Elijah stood up, grabbing his backpack, he glanced back at the sea of model planes scattered across the carpet. He promised himself, just like he had every time before, that one day those planes wouldn't just be on his floor. One day, they would be in the sky. He would be the one sitting in the cockpit, making his own dreams a reality. With that thought, Elijah bounded out of the room and toward the door, where his mother waited. His excitement surged once more. Today was the day he would board a plane on his own for the first time. But more than that, today was the day he would be following in his father's footsteps, even if he wasn't quite old enough to fly a plane just yet. This was his beginning. This was the first step toward a life that, he knew, would always be in the clouds. The airport encounter. The airport terminal was a vast, bustling space. The loud hum of voices mixed with the clatter of rolling suitcases and the distant, rhythmic beeping of security scanners. Elijah squeezed his mother's hand tightly as they navigated through the crowd. His eyes darted from one part of the terminal to the next, taking in the sight of travelers hurrying toward their gates, flight attendants walking briskly in crisp uniforms, and pilots entering the lounge area, their aviator sunglasses perched coolly atop their noses. Elijah could hardly contain his excitement. This was it, the moment he'd been waiting for, the first time he would board a plane without his parents by his side. He looked up at the massive digital display showing flight information, the words scrolling endlessly across the screen. Flights to New York, Boston, Miami, and more. But none of those flights mattered to him. Today, he wasn't just another passenger. He was Elijah Green, the son of Captain Derek Green, and this was the flight that would change everything. His gaze lingered on the gate for his flight, the one that would take him to his grandmother's house across the country. I can't believe I'm really doing this. Elijah muttered to himself as they approached the security checkpoint. Rachel chuckled, giving her son a sideways glance. You'll be fine, Elijah. You've been dreaming of this moment for years. You know the drill, just follow the signs, stay close, and we'll be good. I know, Elijah responded, his eyes wide with anticipation. He couldn't help but feel a bit nervous now that he was here. This wasn't just a dream, it was happening. He was actually about to board a flight alone for the very first time. They walked through the checkpoint where a security officer asked them to place their bags on the conveyor belt. Elijah fidgeted with the strap of his backpack, his fingers brushing over the soft cloth that covered his precious model airplane. The thought of it being scanned made him nervous, and he held his breath as the bag moved through the X-ray machine. What's in your bag? The officer asked, raising an eyebrow. Elijah's heart skipped a beat. He had heard about kids getting in trouble for bringing forbidden items through security. Was a small model airplane considered a weapon? Or something else that might raise suspicion? His fingers tightened around the strap of his backpack. Before he could answer, the officer began pulling the bag aside for inspection. Elijah's stomach twisted. The officer's eyes fell on the wrapped-up plane inside the bag, and he held it up to examine it more closely. What's this? A toy plane? The officer asked, his voice stern but not unkind. Elijah nodded quickly. It's a model of the plane my dad flies. He's a pilot. He works for this airline. The officer smiled, though there was a slight hesitation in his gaze. That's nice, kid. I'm going to have to check it, though. Airline regulations and all that. You can't be too careful. Rachel stepped up, smiling reassuringly. It's perfectly harmless, I promise. My son just loves planes. And his father's a captain here, so that one means a lot to him. As the officer inspected the plane, Elijah shifted uncomfortably. He knew it was harmless, but it felt strange, almost as if he were under suspicion. Just as the officer was about to move on, a tall flight attendant appeared, striding purposefully down the corridor. Elijah noticed the woman immediately. She was impeccably groomed, with sharp, professional eyes that scanned the surroundings as if she were assessing every detail. The gold stripes on her sleeves indicated she was a senior attendant, someone who had likely seen thousands of passengers pass through this very terminal. She stopped right next to Elijah and his mother, her gaze flicking from the officer to Elijah's bag, and then back again. Her eyes narrowed ever so slightly. "What's going on here?" she asked in a tone that suggested impatience. Elijah didn't understand why the woman's expression seemed so cold. She didn't seem to be the type of person who would warm up to children, or anyone, for that matter. The officer quickly explained the situation, just a child's toy, nothing more, and gestured toward Elijah's backpack. The flight attendant's lips pressed into a thin line as she regarded Elijah's model plane with visible distaste. "A toy plane, huh?" she muttered, as though the very idea was beneath her. "I don't know if that's allowed on board. Children shouldn't be carrying things like that. We don't want distractions in the cabin." Elijah's heart sank. He hadn't expected this. He had always been so respectful of the airline's rules and regulations, and the thought that his beloved plane might be confiscated filled him with anxiety. He clutched his backpack tighter, as if willing the situation to resolve itself. The flight attendant glanced down at him, her expression stiff. "What's your father's name?" she asked abruptly. "Elijah." Rachel intervened before her son could answer. "I don't think that's necessary. The plane is harmless, and my son's simply excited about flying alone for the first time." The attendant didn't seem to soften, but before the situation could escalate any further, a calm, authoritative voice came from behind them. "Is there a problem here?" Everyone turned at once, and Elijah's eyes widened as he saw a man in a sharp pilot's uniform approaching. His father's presence was commanding but kind. It was Captain Derek Green, Elijah's dad. Elijah's relief was immediate, like a weight lifting from his shoulders. He had seen his father handle all kinds of situations at work, and he knew this would be no different. The flight attendant immediately straightened up, her entire demeanor shifting. "Captain Green," she said, her voice now overly formal, almost apologetic. "I wasn't aware. I was just addressing an issue with this child's toy." "His toy?" Captain Green repeated, his eyebrows rising in mild surprise. He looked down at Elijah, then back at the flight attendant. "This is my son, Elijah. And I can assure you, there's no issue with the model plane. It's harmless, as you can see." The flight attendant shifted uncomfortably but did not respond. The officer, realizing who Captain Green was, nodded with a mixture of respect and slight embarrassment. "I apologize for the confusion, Captain. We just have to follow the rules." Captain Green gave the officer a warm smile. "Of course. I understand. Just make sure we're treating everyone with respect. Elijah, come here, son." He gestured for Elijah to step closer, and with an enormous grin, Elijah ran toward his father, eager to be near him. The flight attendant remained silent, her face flushed as she turned away. Elijah couldn't help but feel a surge of pride. He had always known that his father was important, but now, seeing how everyone reacted to him, it became even clearer. As they moved forward to the departure gate, Captain Green placed a hand on Elijah's shoulder. "You okay?" he asked, his voice steady and reassuring. Elijah nodded. "Yeah, Dad. I'm good now. Thanks for helping." "You don't need to thank me, son," Captain Green said with a chuckle. You're a part of this airline, just like I am. And I'll always have your back." Elijah smiled, the tension of the moment fading into the background. He was ready for the flight ahead, ready to prove to himself that he belonged in the skies, just like his father. The journey begins. As the plane continued its taxi to the runway, Elijah pressed his face against the cool glass of the window, his eyes scanning the vast expanse of the airport. The ground seemed to tilt beneath him as the plane slowly picked up speed, rolling across the tarmac like a giant caterpillar preparing to break free from the earth. Elijah's heart raced as he imagined the engines revving louder, like the roar of a wild animal ready to take flight. In that moment, everything he had read about aviation, every story he had heard, and every dream he had about soaring through the skies seemed to converge into one grand, magnificent moment. The world outside the window was shrinking, the buildings growing smaller, the trees turning into patches of green, and the cars now mere specks in the distance. Elijah's pulse quickened as the plane picked up speed. This is it. We're really doing this. Elijah thought to himself, his fingers gripping the armrests tightly. He had read stories about pilots who had taken off in weather far worse than this, flying through storms and gusty winds. But today, the sky was a vast, endless blue, a perfect canvas for his adventure. This was his first solo flight, and it was perfect, just like his dream. The engines roared louder as the plane reached full speed. Elijah felt a familiar flutter in his stomach, a mix of excitement and nervousness, as the wheels lifted off the ground. The plane's gentle ascent into the sky made him feel weightless, as though he were floating on air, free from the world below. His eyes widened as he gazed at the sprawling city below, watching the roads disappear into the horizon and the buildings shrinking into miniature versions of themselves. "This is incredible," Elijah whispered to himself, barely able to believe that he was actually up here, so high above the ground. He had always known that planes could fly, but to actually experience it firsthand, to be inside the plane as it sliced through the clouds, was a feeling beyond words. The fasten seatbelt sign flickered off, and the seatbelt sign went dark as the plane leveled out. Elijah sat back in his seat, trying to catch his breath. His hands rested on the tray table in front of him, feeling the smooth, cool surface as he let the excitement settle inside him. This was his moment to shine, to prove to himself that he was capable of handling whatever came next. From the moment the plane had taken off, Elijah had felt an unspoken connection to it. It was as if the plane was alive, as if it knew he was here, ready to be part of the sky. And it was doing its job flawlessly, gently carrying him through the air, guiding him to his next adventure. A flight attendant passed by, noticing Elijah gazing out the window. "Is everything all right, young man?" she asked with a friendly smile. Elijah turned toward her, nodding eagerly. "Yeah, everything's great. I've always wanted to do this." The attendant's smile widened, clearly seeing the excitement in his eyes. "Well, you're in good hands. If you need anything, just let me know, all right?" "Thanks," Elijah replied, his voice filled with enthusiasm. He settled into his seat once again, but this time, a different feeling washed over him. It wasn't just the awe of flying anymore, it was a sense of belonging. It was as if he was no longer just a passenger. He was part of something much larger than himself, something that connected him to a legacy of pilots, crew members, and people who made this journey possible every single day. As the plane soared higher into the sky, Elijah felt the familiar sensation of peace and wonder. The clouds below them looked like soft cotton blankets, and the sky stretched on forever, endless and welcoming. The sheer expanse of it all seemed to promise that anything was possible. There were no limits here. Anything Elijah wanted to do, anything he could dream of, was within reach. A few moments passed, and the captain's voice came through the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We've reached cruising altitude, and will be on our way to our destination shortly. Sit back, relax, and enjoy the flight." Elijah listened intently, hearing his father's voice so clearly in his mind. "This is what you do every day, Dad," he thought. "You make this look so easy, but it's so much more than that. You're creating memories. You're giving people an experience." He imagined what it must be like for his father, sitting at the front of the plane, his hands on the controls, his eyes scanning the horizon as the miles stretched ahead of them. To be the one guiding the plane through the air, making decisions that affected the safety and well-being of everyone on board, that was a responsibility like no other. Elijah respected that. He had always respected that. The flight attendants moved down the aisles, offering drinks and snacks. Elijah accepted a small package of pretzels, but his mind wasn't focused on food. He was deep in thought, contemplating the journey ahead of him, not just this flight, but his future in aviation. The dream had always been to fly. Ever since he was old enough to understand the concept of flight, Elijah had imagined himself sitting in a cockpit, commanding an aircraft, feeling the power of the plane beneath him. But it wasn't just about the flying itself. It was about the responsibility, the dedication, and the commitment that came with it. The pilots he admired weren't just great at flying, they were great at making sure their passengers felt safe, comfortable, and valued. As the plane continued its smooth journey, Elijah felt a warmth spread through him, knowing that he was on the path his father had walked before him. And while he wasn't yet old enough to sit in the cockpit himself, this was a first step. A step toward something greater. He glanced down at his model airplane, now resting on his lap. It seemed almost like a part of him. He had carried it with him all these years, his father's airline, his father's plane. His father had taken him on countless flights, teaching him the ins and outs of aviation, answering questions, sharing stories about the skies. But now, it was time for Elijah to take his own step into the sky, to make the journey alone. The flight attendants were now offering small trays with meals, and Elijah's stomach rumbled. Despite his excitement, he was starting to feel the hunger of travel. He looked around the cabin at the other passengers, noting their quiet conversations and peaceful expressions. Everyone seemed so calm, so accustomed to the routine of flying. For Elijah, this was still a dream come true, and he knew he wouldn't take it for granted. He unwrapped the meal, a simple sandwich and fruit cup, but it felt like a feast. With each bite, he felt a little more at home in this world of aviation. His dream was no longer distant. It was tangible, real. As the plane flew through the sky, so too did his aspirations begin to soar. Hours passed, and soon the captain's voice came through the intercom again. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are beginning our descent into our destination. Please make sure your seatbelt is fastened and your tray tables are up." Elijah straightened up, his eyes shining as he looked out the window once more. The ground was drawing closer, and he could see the patchwork of fields, roads, and small towns stretching below. It felt like the world was welcoming him, and as the plane banked to the left, Elijah had one final thought: one day, I'll be the one flying this plane. One day, I'll be the one guiding others through the skies. The unexpected challenge. The plane descended steadily, with the ground below growing clearer and more distinct with every passing moment. Elijah's heart skipped a beat, not from nerves, but from excitement. He had seen countless landings from the comfort of the cabin, but this time, he was experiencing it as the lone passenger, with nothing between him and the adventure ahead. As the plane began its final approach, the cabin grew a little quieter. Passengers shifted in their seats, fastening seatbelts and adjusting their trays, all preparing for the final stretch of their journey. Elijah, however, was caught in a different kind of anticipation. He had been on many flights before, but today felt like a rite of passage, a moment he would look back on for years to come. The realization that he was flying alone for the first time, crossing the country to visit his grandmother, struck him once again. As the aircraft turned smoothly toward its landing direction, Elijah took one last look at the window. He could see the sprawling city below, with its clusters of buildings and streets like veins of a living organism stretching endlessly into the horizon. The thought of touching down in this new city made him feel like a true traveler, someone who could claim the skies as his own. The reality of the moment filled him with a sense of awe, as he realized just how vast the world was, and how far he had already come. But as the plane began its descent, something unexpected happened. The seatbelt sign flickered on, signaling that they were about to land. The familiar voice of the captain came through the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our final approach. Please make sure your seatbelts are fastened and your seats are in the upright position. We'll be landing shortly." Elijah, as always, followed the instructions to the letter, tightening his seatbelt and ensuring his tray table was securely fastened. However, a strange feeling suddenly took hold of him, a sense that something wasn't quite right. He couldn't put his finger on it, but the usual smooth descent now seemed a bit more turbulent. There was an unfamiliar shaking, a slight jitter that wasn't typical during the final approach. The plane's engines buzzed a little louder, and Elijah's pulse quickened. He glanced around at the other passengers. They were all sitting calmly, some reading books, others watching movies on their tablets. No one else seemed to notice the change in the air, but for some reason, Elijah's instincts told him to pay attention. The shaking intensified, and the plane tilted slightly, as if adjusting to something beyond its control. Elijah's stomach twisted in an uneasy knot. His hands clenched the armrests as the aircraft shuddered again. The hum of the engines deepened, and a soft but unmistakable sound, the sound of the plane's wheels adjusting, was heard. Elijah had never experienced turbulence like this before. The flight attendants moved through the aisle with steady calmness, serving drinks to passengers who seemed unfazed by the unusual movement. The captain's voice crackled once more over the intercom, and the calm reassurance in his voice only served to increase Elijah's anxiety. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're encountering some unexpected turbulence. Please remain in your seats and keep your seatbelts fastened. We'll be through this shortly." Elijah's mind raced. Turbulence was normal, he knew that. Every pilot had to deal with it at some point, and every flight was equipped to handle it. But there was something different about this. This felt more prolonged, more intense. The plane felt almost like a living creature caught in the grip of something it couldn't control. Elijah swallowed hard, his chest tightening. This was no longer just about the destination. This was about how the plane, and its crew, would handle the situation. Elijah's mind flashed to the stories his father had told him, tales of pilots who had dealt with unexpected weather and rough conditions, managing to steer through with calm professionalism and skill. Elijah had always admired how his father stayed calm in the face of danger, how his steady hands gripped the controls while the storm raged outside. This is what it means to be a pilot, Elijah thought. This is the part they don't show in the movies. This is real. As the plane dipped again, Elijah felt a sharp twinge of fear. The ground below him seemed to tilt unnaturally. The sky outside had shifted from its calm blue to a dull gray, thick clouds swirling in the distance. For a moment, the plane was shrouded in mist, and all Elijah could see outside the window were swirling clouds, both close and far away. Suddenly, there was a sharp jerk, followed by a loud thud that reverberated through the entire cabin. The fastened seatbelt sign flickered back on, and the plane's nose dipped just slightly. Elijah's stomach lurched, and a cold sweat broke out across his forehead. His hand instinctively reached for the seatbelt, tightening it again, his knuckles white from the pressure. The flight attendants moved efficiently down the aisle, their faces betraying a hint of concern, but they continued to assist passengers with smooth professionalism. One of the attendants walked past Elijah's seat, pausing for just a moment. She leaned down and whispered softly to him. "You're doing great, kid. Just remember, pilots are trained for moments like this. You're in good hands." Elijah nodded, trying to convince himself that everything would be all right. He had heard those words from his father before, and while they were comforting, they didn't take away the gnawing fear in his gut. This wasn't a flight from his father's home airport to a nearby city. This was an unpredictable storm, and the turbulence wasn't just shaking the plane, it was shaking his confidence. As the plane climbed higher again, the turbulence seemed to subside. Elijah's heartbeat returned to normal, but the unease lingered. The sky cleared up in the distance, the clouds breaking apart as the plane rose out of their reach. Slowly but surely, the shaking stopped, and the plane once again became a smooth, steady glide through the air. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're through the turbulence," the captain's voice came over the intercom, sounding as calm as ever. "We'll be landing in just a few minutes. Thank you for your patience." The cabin slowly settled. The murmurs of passengers, the quiet shuffling of papers, and the clink of trays being placed back in the seat pockets returned to their normal rhythm. Elijah, however, was still processing the experience. His hands were still trembling, and his mind was racing. What if something had gone wrong? What if the turbulence had gotten worse? What if the flight crew hadn't been able to handle it? But then, as if in answer to his swirling doubts, Elijah remembered something his father had always told him. No matter what happens in the air, trust the process. Trust the crew. The plane is built to handle it. The pilots are trained for it. He exhaled, slowly, and allowed himself to relax. He had watched his father take control in moments of crisis many times. His dad had always been a picture of calm, his face a steady mask of confidence no matter how bumpy the flight became. Elijah had seen it firsthand, and he knew that one day, he would be able to do the same. As the plane made its final descent, Elijah felt a sense of calm wash over him. This was still his moment. His first solo flight. He had made it through the turbulence, and he was stronger for it. In just a few minutes, the plane would touch down on the runway, and Elijah would land in a new city, one step closer to his journey in aviation. But more than that, he would carry this moment with him forever. The fear, the challenge, and the reminder that it wasn't just about the destination, but about how you handled the journey. The moment of clarity. As the plane's wheels touched down with a soft bump, Elijah's heart gave one last jolt before settling into a rhythm. The entire cabin shifted in unison, the sound of the wheels scraping against the runway giving way to the comforting hum of the brakes as the plane began to slow. Elijah could feel the weight of the aircraft shifting, the gentle resistance as it moved across the tarmac toward the gate. The familiar sound of the engines calming down made him exhale a deep, relieved breath. He didn't realize until this moment how much he had been holding his breath throughout the flight, how much the unknowns of turbulence had clenched his chest in quiet anxiety. But now, with the plane on solid ground, a sense of calm washed over him. The journey wasn't over, but he had crossed the hardest part. He had faced the challenge and emerged stronger. As the plane rolled toward the terminal, Elijah glanced out the window one more time, his thoughts drifting back to the moment of turbulence. It had been an unexpected trial, but one that had shifted something inside him. It was no longer just about the thrill of the flight or the anticipation of seeing his grandmother. It was about understanding the complexity and beauty of what was happening in the sky. The entire experience, from the nervous anticipation before takeoff to the nerve-wracking turbulence and the ultimate sense of safety in the hands of the pilots, had given him a deeper appreciation for the role of a flight crew. The plane came to a complete stop, the engines winding down to a quiet hum. The flight attendants moved through the aisles once more, checking that everyone was ready to disembark. Elijah's seatbelt unclicked with a soft ping, and the sign above his head turned off. He slowly stood up, stretching his stiff legs and feeling the weight of the journey lifting as he stood. The other passengers began to gather their belongings, chatting amongst themselves as the doors opened to let the air bridge connect to the plane. Elijah felt the excitement stirring again, the rush of being in a new city, ready for his next adventure. But before he could reach for his bag, a flight attendant approached him, offering a warm smile. "You did great," she said, her voice calm and reassuring. I know it can be a little unnerving when the ride gets bumpy, but you handled it like a pro. Elijah smiled back, feeling a surge of pride. Thanks. I was a little scared at first, but I remembered everything my dad told me about pilots handling situations like that. The attendant nodded. You've got a good role model. Keep that confidence with you on every flight, all right? Elijah's heart swelled with gratitude as he nodded. It wasn't just his father's teachings that had helped him through the turbulent moments, it was the reminder that he was part of something bigger. He wasn't just a passenger in this world of aviation. He was learning, growing, and becoming a part of the flight experience, piece by piece. As he stepped off the plane and walked into the terminal, the first thing Elijah noticed was the unmistakable hum of excitement in the air. The bustling crowds, the movement of families reuniting, and the steady rhythm of people coming and going from all over the world. He could hear snippets of different languages, see signs pointing to various gates, and feel the rush of travelers eager to begin or end their journeys. He paused for a moment, just taking it all in. The airport was like a crossroads of the world, a place where lives intersected and stories unfolded with every passing second. And in this moment, Elijah realized just how much this journey meant to him. It wasn't just about flying to a new place, it was about the growth he had experienced within himself, the strength he had found in the face of fear, and the knowledge that he was ready for whatever came next. His grandmother was waiting for him just beyond security, and the thought of seeing her again made him smile. She was always so full of life, with her stories about the world, her adventures, and the wisdom she had gained over the years. She would be proud of him. She would be proud of how far he had come, and how he had handled everything that came his way. The journey through the airport was easy, a blur of lines, signs, and the constant flow of people heading toward their destinations. But Elijah wasn't focused on the crowds or the busy terminals. His mind was still processing everything that had happened, the turbulence, the fear, and the overwhelming sense of accomplishment that followed. As he approached the baggage claim area, he caught sight of his grandmother standing by the carousel. She was exactly as he remembered her, with her gray hair pulled back into a neat bun and a bright smile that lit up her face. She waved excitedly when she saw him, her eyes filled with love and warmth. "Elijah! You made it," she called out, her voice carrying across the busy terminal. Elijah's heart swelled with happiness as he rushed toward her. He hadn't seen her in over a year, and the distance between them had made the reunion all the more special. She wrapped him in a tight hug, her arms enveloping him in a comforting embrace. "I'm so proud of you, sweetheart," she said, her voice full of emotion. "I heard you flew here alone. How was it?" Elijah beamed, his excitement returning in full force. "It was amazing, Grandma. There was some turbulence, but I remembered everything Dad taught me, and I made it through." His grandmother pulled back, looking at him with a mix of admiration and pride. "That's my boy. You've got the heart of a pilot in you, don't you?" Elijah's smile widened as he nodded. "I think I do, Grandma. I think I really do." Together, they picked up his bag from the carousel and headed out of the airport. As they walked, Elijah felt a deep sense of peace settle within him. He had faced the challenge of flying alone and had emerged from it stronger, braver, and more confident than ever before. The world around him felt bigger, but he knew that he was now ready to navigate it. There was a time when this journey would have seemed like a distant dream. But now, with the turbulence behind him and the excitement of the adventure ahead, Elijah knew that he had taken his first real steps toward his future. He was no longer just a boy with a love for planes, he was becoming a young man who understood the true meaning of perseverance, confidence, and the power of trusting himself. As he and his grandmother left the airport, the horizon stretched ahead of them, full of new possibilities. Elijah knew that he had many more flights to take, many more challenges to face, and many more lessons to learn. But for now, as he stood there with his grandmother, he was content to savor this moment, his first solo flight, the one that had changed everything. And as they walked through the doors and into the waiting world, Elijah couldn't help but smile. The sky was no longer a distant dream. It was his. The journey ahead. The warm breeze of the city greeted Elijah as he stepped out of the airport with his grandmother by his side. The sunlight bathed the world in a soft golden glow, the afternoon hours giving everything an almost magical quality. Elijah could feel the weight of the journey easing off his shoulders with every step they took, his heart lighter with the anticipation of the days ahead. The turbulence, the unease, the unknowns, those were now distant memories, tucked safely away in the past. Today was a new beginning, and he was ready to embrace it. His grandmother's hand rested gently on his shoulder as they walked toward the waiting taxi. "I'm so glad you're here, Elijah. There's so much I want to show you. This city is full of history, stories, and places I know you'll love." Her voice was warm, filled with the wisdom of someone who had seen and experienced the world in ways that were sometimes hard to articulate but always heartfelt. Elijah smiled up at her, already eager for the adventure to unfold. "I can't wait, Grandma. But first, I want to hear about your latest adventures. You always have the best stories." His grandmother chuckled, her eyes twinkling with amusement. "Well, I don't know about the best stories, but I do have a few. But let's get settled in first, okay? We'll have plenty of time for stories." They climbed into the taxi, and the driver set off toward the heart of the city. The streets seemed to stretch endlessly, filled with the buzz of people and the sounds of the city pulsing around them. Elijah gazed out of the window, his mind still reflecting on the events of the flight. The adventure was far from over. The city was new to him, full of possibility and excitement, but he knew that something more important had changed within him. He felt it in his bones, the belief that the world was his to explore, that the challenges he had faced, whether in the air or on the ground, had prepared him for whatever was to come. As the taxi wound through the city streets, Elijah felt his curiosity ignite. He had always been fascinated by stories of distant lands, exotic places, and new experiences, and now he was finally in one of those places himself. The buildings, the shops, the people, they all seemed so different from his hometown, so full of new energy. But the underlying hum of life, the bustle of the city, was something he could relate to, something he could understand. When they arrived at his grandmother's home, a charming old house tucked away on a quiet street lined with trees, Elijah felt a rush of comfort. It was the kind of house that exuded warmth and history, its ivy-clad walls and the soft scent of old wood telling tales of generations who had walked these halls before him. His grandmother led him inside, showing him to the cozy guest room where he would be staying during his visit. The bed was made with crisp linens, and the window overlooked a small garden filled with flowers in bloom. "You'll be comfortable here," she said with a soft smile. "I want you to feel at home." Elijah sat on the bed for a moment, taking in his new surroundings. He hadn't been to this city in years, and now that he was back, it felt almost like a dream. A dream that was unfolding before his eyes, full of potential and unknown surprises. After settling in, his grandmother took him on a tour of the neighborhood. The streets were lined with rows of trees, their branches forming a canopy overhead, and there was a small park just a few blocks away where children played and couples walked hand in hand. The air was fresh, and the scent of blooming flowers filled the spaces between the buildings. Elijah felt like he was walking through a storybook, each step taking him further into the pages of a world he had only ever read about. They visited a few shops, some filled with local crafts, others with antiques, but each place had a story to tell, something unique to offer. It was in these small details, these quiet moments, that Elijah began to understand the rhythm of the city. There was a kind of magic in the everyday, the ordinary places people walked past without a second thought, and it filled him with a sense of wonder. Later that evening, as they sat down to a delicious homemade dinner, Elijah could feel the comfort of being surrounded by family, by a place that held so much history. His grandmother had a way of weaving stories into everything, her words painting vivid pictures of the past. She told him about the history of the city, the landmarks they'd seen earlier, and the people who had shaped its character. As they ate, Elijah listened intently, realizing that there was so much to learn. He had always been interested in planes, the skies, and the mysteries of the world above him, but sitting there with his grandmother, hearing about the world from a different perspective, opened his mind to new possibilities. "Grandma," Elijah asked as they finished their meal, "do you think I could do something great with my life? Like, something that would matter to people?" His grandmother looked at him with a mixture of affection and understanding. "Elijah, my dear, greatness isn't about fame or wealth. It's about the mark you leave on the world, the way you touch the lives of others. And from what I see in you, you already have something special inside of you. The way you faced the turbulence today, the way you handled the challenges, you're already on your way." Her words settled deep within him, like a seed planted in fertile soil. Elijah felt something shift inside of him, something he couldn't quite explain but knew was important. He had always dreamed of being a pilot, of flying high in the sky, but now, as he sat there in his grandmother's warm kitchen, he realized that his dreams were bigger than just the flight itself. He didn't just want to fly. He wanted to make a difference, to have a purpose, to live a life that mattered. That night, after his grandmother had gone to bed, Elijah stood by the window of his guest room, looking out at the city. The stars above were bright, a reminder that no matter how far he traveled, the universe was vast, and there was so much more to discover. He felt a deep sense of responsibility settle over him. He wasn't just a passenger in this world, he was a part of something bigger. He had the power to shape his own path, to be brave enough to face the unknowns, and to carry with him the lessons he had learned from the skies. The next day, as he stood by the window of the small cafe they visited together, watching the morning light spill over the streets, Elijah knew that he was beginning a new chapter of his life. His journey had only just begun. The path before him was filled with challenges, yes, but also with immense opportunity. He had faced turbulence in the skies and had come out stronger. And now, as he looked toward the horizon, he was ready for whatever adventure lay ahead. His dreams were no longer confined to just the world of aviation. They had expanded, becoming something far greater. He didn't just want to fly, he wanted to explore, to understand, to give back. The world was his, and it was up to him to navigate it. As his grandmother gently took his hand and they walked through the city streets, Elijah knew that this was only the beginning. He had so much more to discover, so much more to learn. But no matter where his path took him, he would carry with him the courage, the strength, and the wisdom to soar, just like the planes he had always admired.